and welcome back to Spicy Brain podcast. On today's episode, we have someone very, 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 very special joining us as a guest, not only because it's the first ever guest that Spicy Brain has, but because of all the accolades he has. He is incredibly influential within the autism field. And if you're autistic, you probably know who he is, or you've somehow learned through his work. If you're not autistic or not familiar with the field, you might not know, but we're going to change that today. And a little bit of context on him. If you are into running, like I am, shocker, he is the Kipchoge of autism, okay? If you're into your social medias, he is the Kim Kardashian of autism. He probably won't like that reference, so we'll move on. But if you're into your nature and your TV and your documentaries, he is the David Attenborough of autism. So that is the type of caliber of a guest we have on today, and I am so excited. His influence is well warranted because he has been in the industry for over 30 years. He is a doctor at Sheffield Hallam University, and he has not only written 1 or 2 or 3 books, he has written a total of 8 books. And his most recent book is on reasonable adjustments for autistic adults. That covers topics from higher education all the way through to workplace accommodations, which is going to be the main topic of today's podcast. All of these books are widely regarded by autistic adults, by family members, by allies, by other professors. And yes, he is UK based, but as you can see, his impact is far greater than the UK because he has had such an impact on global autistic communities that I don't even think he'll ever realize how much he's changed people's lives with all the work that he does. So without further ado, Luke Beardon, welcome to the Spicy Brain podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Lara. Thank you for inviting me. When you were doing that, I was kind of like thinking, I want to meet this guy. He sounds amazing. Doesn't sound like me at all.
It must be surreal to hear all of those different accolades in third person when it's been spoken about you. So I'm sure you're proud of that.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm honoured to be here, and that's very kind of you to introduce me in that way. It's interesting that you refer to me as an expert, and I absolutely would not agree with that. I think, and what it does genuinely, in terms of getting right into it, it worries me when people claim to be experts in autism. Because you can't be. You can't, because autism is human beings, and you are not an expert in every autistic human being. Yep. Nobody has met all autistic human beings. And because every single autistic person you meet is going to teach you something new, you can't be expert in all of those. So I think you can have expertise in certain areas of autism. So I suppose on paper, my expertise would be teaching people about autism. That's my job title anyway. Whether I'm any good at it or not, it's for other people to decide. And you can have expertise as a parent. You can have expertise as an autistic person. You can be multiply expert in various different areas. But to be expert per se in autism, I find it worrying when people claim that.
Definitely. And I think as time has gone on, and of course you've been in the field for over 20 years, and I'm sure you've seen that evolution, but as time has gone on, those expertise, shall we say, have evolved as well, right? Because what we knew autism to be presenting at 20 years ago is completely different to today, and I'm sure that will continue to evolve. So I agree with you. And quite frankly, I don't even know myself sometimes, right? Because my autism some days presents one way and other days I'm completely different and I'm into the opposite thing that I wasn't the other day. So it's definitely a learning process to even get to know myself in that regard. And we'll get into it. But post-diagnosis, the lady who diagnosed me told me, take the first year just to relearn. Don't read too much. Don't try reinvent the wheel. Don't do anything new. Just live life like you were yesterday and relearn the things you like. Try be more aware of your needs and things that trigger you and adapt your life to that. Second year, it'll be a different conversation. We'll see how you get on, but just focus on yourself and just trying to learn a little bit more about yourself. And that was definitely the best advice she could have given me.
I think that's incredible advice. What I find is, and I'm so privileged because so many autistic people share their lives with me and their thoughts with me. That's why it's gorgeous being here today with you to a certain degree. But often people and this will come to no surprise to your autistic listeners, once you've got that identification, so many autistic adults particularly then go and do their homework to the nth degree. They get into that monotropic flow state that, right, I'm going to deep dive into this, and they love it and they love it and they love it. Then they're, hang on a minute, I've just read this autobiography of somebody else and I'm nothing like them. Maybe I'm not really autistic. Maybe I'm an imposter. Maybe I'm not really the same as, and that then becomes a problem. It's like having that that gift of somebody saying, you are your own individual. There will be overlaps in terms of your experiences as an autistic person with other autistic people and sometimes with other marginalized groups as well, but you're not the same. So don't worry if when you're doing your investigations, you don't match up exactly with what you're finding out.
Yeah, and I do remember reading very early on Fern Brady, I believe her name is. She's a Scottish comedian that wrote a biography of her life after being diagnosed late with autism. I found it so refreshing. It was such a relatable experience as a young woman growing up in which I was undiagnosed and uncomfortable in situations, and you would of course gravitate towards, that one drink to get the edge off and be more socially acceptable, shall we say. And then her life evolved into, not having somewhere to stay for a couple of nights and then trying to work in different environments. And I was like, I don't relate to that. But then I had to remind myself, but all the past things that she was talking about, that is exactly my experience. And the reason why she did it is exactly why I used to do it. So I agree with you, like every experience is individual, but it's also so excellent to hear that representation and to feel that you relate to other women.
I was just listening to what you're saying there, and it relates exactly to the topic in terms of reasonable adjustments at work.
Yeah.
One of the questions I get asked, one of the most frequent questions I get asked by parents is, what type of school should I send my child to? Should it be a mainstream school or a special school or an autism specific school or whatever? And I always give the same answer. I say, show me the child, show me the school. Like, it's literally as simple as that. There's no one size fits all.
Yeah.
In the same way, when people say, what reasonable adjustment should we put in at work for autistic people? It's like, well, show me the type of work and show me the autistic person. There's no way of knowing until then. Otherwise, you're probably doing the wrong thing. If you think these are reasonable adjustments that will suit autistic people in that very generic way, it doesn't work like that.
100%. Okay, so you've been in the field for over 20 years. How does one get into the autism field 20 years ago? And what is the type of work you do?
So usually people get into the autism field. Not usually. I don't know if that's accurate. I need to be linguistically accurate. Often people get into the autism field by accident and then subsequently find out they've got all sorts of connections they hadn't realised before. So I don't know if there's some kind of mystical autism magnet going on. I fell into the autism field pretty much by accident. I was a grade 1 support worker in adult learning disabilities, and I still see myself as a grade 1 support worker in learning in supporting adults, autistic adults who have additional learning disabilities. I still see myself as that grade 1 support worker. But the National Autistic Society were actually setting up a service nearby, and I thought I'd apply for a job there. And as soon as I was working explicitly with autistic people, and I did a lot of voluntary work setting up groups for autistic people to chill out together, not social skills groups, I should add, but genuinely social groups from an autistic sociality way. And just spending hours and hours and hours with autistic people, I just completely fell in love with it and never looked back.
Do you feel like in those social setting groups that you had, because I found this in some of my relationships as well, do you feel like neurodivergent or autistic people, we gravitate towards each other? And did you see that experienced within those groups?
It's a brilliant question. I suppose in brief, the answer is yes. I do think that neurodivergent individuals see neurodivergence in one another more easily than the non-neurodivergent individuals see neurodivergence. So two autistic people are more likely to connect, and having that connectivity is more likely, but it's not exclusive. So it drives me, it stresses me out when you read people saying, oh, you can't be in a relationship with a non-autistic person if you're autistic, or it's going to be more difficult, or it's going to be problematic, or inherently it's going to fail. It's like, that's complete rubbish. Two people can get on and two people might not get on. But that level of connectivity, I think, is more frequent when you've got two autistic individuals or groups of autistic individuals in the room. And actually, people will talk to me about that level of connectivity and that depth over a very short period of time. So maybe not even knowing the person particularly well, but almost instantaneously feeling comfortable with them. And that kind of connectivity being quite few and far between.
I can relate to that 100%. And in my relationships with females over the years, growing up, I basically had no girlfriends. I was like, I would get along more with the boys. They were more direct. They were, less read between the lines. There was less social dynamics with boys as well. So I never really had girlfriends. And as I've grown up and post my diagnosis, now I'm not diagnosing any of my friends whatsoever. I am far from an expert to do that. But sometimes I see things that I think maybe that is why we get along. You don't enjoy loud environments. You enjoy being indoors and having a more one-to-one conversation versus, being amongst a group of 55 people and being the loudest in the room. And maybe that's why we connect, right? So I've always had that question as to do autistic people gravitate towards each other? And I do agree with you. It's a matter of recognizing those traits easier. And maybe that's where the bond commences. Okay, so 20 years ago, that's when you started in the autism field. How has the space changed, say, 20 years ago through till today?
Well, actually, I know it's 30 years ago because
30?
I was asked by Jessica Kingsley to write a chapter in a book called 30 Years of Change. And they contacted me because they said you were around 30 years ago in terms of working in the field.
Another decade.
I'm showing my
then.
age. Oh, my goodness. So I worked this out once. On average, once every 6 months, I wake up in the morning and I think, I'm going to quit. Not existentially, but I mean,
story of my life.
I'm going to quit the autism field. I give up. There's no point. Nothing ever changes. I'm so sick of it all. I hear the same stories over and over again. And then by lunchtime, I've kind of grown up and be like, no, it's fine. Things have changed. And actually, you have to take that step back. And things are changing far too slowly for my liking.
Agreed.
But there has been more change exponentially over the last, say, 5 to 10 years than there were over the previous probably 50 to 60 years. So actually, the rate of change is increasing, which is brilliant. So more and more, as you said, more and more females are being identified as autistic.
Yep.
I think there's almost like a lost generation of adults who maybe will never get that identification.
I think that generation is one above me.
I think you're probably right.
The likes of my parents and across the board. And of course, as we know with autism, it comes through genetics. That's one of the things we might know, right? Do we really know how it happens? But that is one of the things that I've read, that it comes through genetics. However, I do believe as well the delay in diagnosis is because that lost generation hasn't received a diagnosis. Therefore, for their children, or it never happens, or it happens much later in life.
Or they make that realization when their children have been identified. It makes me laugh. One of those myths, so many myths of autism, but one of those things that you hear occasionally, less so now than 30 years ago, but you can't be autistic because you've got children. And I always my inner voice just wants to say, where do you think they're all coming from?
That is so true. We didn't lick it off the ground, did we?
Don't start that as a myth. That would be a good one, wouldn't it?
100%. So you say the rate at which the awareness is growing has happened exponentially over the last, say, 5 to 10 years. What do you put that down to?
Autistic voice. The growing autistic community who are willing and able to speak up for themselves and the rest of the autistic community. So I think there's a distinction between the autistic community, made up purely of autistic individuals, and the autism community, made up of those autistic individuals and then their allies, friends, relationships, clinicians, professionals, educators, whoever it might be. And of course, they might be autistic themselves as well. And obviously, the autism community is bigger by definition than the autistic community, but both of those communities are growing in terms of their voice. And not only that, I hope I'm right in saying there's an increase in people's willingness to listen, because you need both. You need people to have the voice, but then you need people to listen. And I still get frustrated at the lack of listening, but I think it's probably getting better.
That's excellent. And I think something that I that I hear in what you say is the allies, the people around people that do have autism. And I'll give you an example. My partner is a dentist and he rarely deals with kids, but when he does, sometimes the kids might show signs that they might have autism, and the parents don't know, or they haven't declared that when they've checked in. And he very kindly, using me as a reference, or has that conversation with the parents, and they've come back thanking him for that because a child has then gone on to gain an autism diagnosis. So I feel like it's that cobweb effect that really helps spread the word about autism and helps other people find that diagnosis and to get better answers for themselves. And as we know, the sooner that happens, the better in life, right? So hopefully, as we move forward, that continues with the exponential growth. Okay, before we get into it, with awareness and with this growing conversation about autism, there are so many terms on how to address an autistic person, from high functioning to low support needs to, I've seen you shiver, to profoundly autistic. I'm autistic and I'm confused. So I can only imagine how someone who's not autistic might feel. Help us get it right. What is the correct terminology for this?
I would hesitate to justify that there's a binary right or wrong right across the board.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you've used person first and identity first language. I tend to only use identity first
Mm-hmm.
language, which tends to be the preference of
Yeah.
most autistic adults.
Mm-hmm.
So, identity first being autistic person rather than person first person with autism. However, it's not black and white. There are some autistic people who say, no, I prefer to have person first language. And then there are other people who say, oh, no, it's whatever.
Mm.
So that in terms of person first and identity first, there's a clear preference for one way of speaking within the autistic population that isn't necessarily shared outside of the autistic population. But that's one thing that has actually changed, interestingly. You talk about change. It's much more likely now to see identity first language in policies, in governance and so on. Whereas 30 years ago, you would be told off for using identity first. And I love that. I love that there's been that change, that autistic people have claimed that identity and said, no, we're not ashamed of being autistic. It's part of who we are.
Yep.
It's an intrinsic part of who we are. So actually using identity first language is preferable rather than seen as something problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a real good tangible example of change over the last few decades and what have you. In terms of those other kind of concepts rather than terminology, I may well be wrong, but I strongly reject functioning labels, for example, or the concept of the severity of autism. So I love visual depictions and I love analogies and metaphors. And I think there's a one-dimensional view, which is a single line, which used to be the case. People used to think there is autism and it's one line, and at one end it's severe and at one end it's mild, and I don't think that's true at all. Then there's more of a two-dimensional view, which is sort of a wavy line. Then there's the three-dimensional view, which is more of a constellation. So Caroline Hirst and people like that, who talk about the constellation. I prefer a four-dimensional view where you've got the constellation kind of depiction along with time and environment. So actually that's 5 dimensions really. And I don't know how long we've been talking, but it's taken me this long before I shoehorn my self-professed golden equation of autism plus environment equals outcome.
Okay.
And I genuinely believe in that equation, which is why I reject functioning labels. So if the outcome is poor functioning, it's not the autism, it's the autism plus the environment that individual is in, which also includes time. So I'm not pointing the finger necessarily at you, and we've only just met today, but I would bet my mortgage on the fact that over a period of time, even say one day, you will be functioning better at certain times during the day than at others. But you've got the same brain. You're the same autistic person. So if you're functioning better in one environment than in another, that's got to be environmental. It can't be just down to you being autistic. Otherwise, your functioning would be exactly the same continuously. And that's not the case at all. And actually, those extremes of functioning in the same individual are obvious to see. So you can have somebody who one day is a world-leading expert and another day be sectioned in a psychiatric unit, functioning very poorly. You might have an individual who is very verbally articulate in the morning and then situationally non-verbal in the afternoon. And actually talking about language, this is a good example of evolution of language. I used very deliberately use the term situationally non-verbal
I love that.
As opposed to selective mutism,
Yes.
because selective mutism puts the onus of responsibility on the individual as if they've got a choice. And I'm sorry, but to your listeners, if anybody is sitting there and you've never been so anxious that you're unable to speak, then I'm very pleased for you. If you're one of those unfortunate individuals who have been so anxious you're unable to speak, then the idea that that's your choice is absolutely abhorrent.
I completely agree with you, because even as someone who on paper I am level 1 autism, I have then been subsequently said to be low support needs and high functioning. And I struggled with that idea because I thought that is what I need to fit into. And I cannot claim anything outside of that box. I cannot be low functioning. However, if you see me yesterday in the morning, I was all beans, happy, go lucky, I was chatting loads. Then comes the afternoon, had a little meltdown. Couldn't speak much. All I wanted was to be left alone in the dark room, sleep, have a hot water bottle on my chest. And that doesn't look very functioning, does it? But no one really sees that. And your needs fluctuate within 24 hours. So how can we determine by being level 1 you're forever high functioning? Because that is not true to my experience.
And I also think it's incredibly othering, because what other population within what I refer to as the predominant neurotype, where is the labeling of those individuals' support needs? Where there's that branding of, right, now we've decided that you're non-neurodivergent, we are now going to identify what level of support you require. It doesn't happen. So why does it then happen because you've got an identification of autism? That is, to me, that's extraordinary. Now, othering, sorry, I should finish my sentences. But I absolutely understand it in terms of individuals getting the support that they require, but to be almost branded in that category as if it's a static, non-evolutionary thing seems to me to be incredibly short-sighted. And you're absolutely right. It's like people don't see what goes on behind the scenes. So what you see might be, oh, this is a very, in inverted commas, high-functioning individual. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes. You don't know how much masking that individual is doing. You don't know what has led up to that point. You don't know what goes on behind after that point. So taking the individual as a whole, every individual has support needs in some areas and less support needs in others.
Okay, so shall we land on it's someone with autism and that's it, unless we're exploring the environment and the outcome that that is creating for that person?
Do you know what? I think using the term autism is brilliant. So I totally reject the term autistic spectrum disorder. So I don't like the term spectrum. I like it as it was originally used in terms of the heterogeneity of the population, the diversity of the population, which is essentially infinite. There are as many different types of autism as there are autistic people, if you like, which is why I think subcategorizing or labeling different types of autism seems to me nonsensical. You can't have it both ways. You can't say all autistic people are individuals and then go, but these individuals are the same. I don't see how that works. So that's why I don't like the term spectrum, and I absolutely reject the term disorder, because I think that's just inhumane to say all autistic people are disordered humans. That's just downright mean, let alone, I think, inaccurate. And people then say, well, what would you say then? So, well, say the person is autistic. Simple as that. I don't see any issue with that whatsoever.
Okay, perfect. Well, to our listeners, that's where we're landing. It's a person that's autistic or a person with autism. Okay, so on to the book. The reason why I was so passionate to having you on the podcast is because workplace accommodations have shaped my career over the past 10 years. And I say that also to notice that I got diagnosed mid-career, say. So my 20s, my career was my thing. I was so passionate about it. Turns out it was my hyperfixation. And workplace accommodations became something prevalent towards the end of my 20s. And I'll give you a little bit of context. So I studied hotel management and business, and I went into working in that field straight out of university. Now, it's an extremely, how should I call it, regimented industry, okay? You are surrounded by guidelines and ethos and language to use and how to address people and ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen and all this jazz, okay? Up to the level of like, what nail color should you wear? How much makeup? How long your skirt should be? And initially, that's a shock factor. Like, wow, is that necessary? Turns out I thrived in that environment. And I didn't know I was autistic, but I was obviously craving some rules because I really enjoyed that environment. And I do feel like having that amount of support and guidance on how to act in an environment, it gave me all the rule book. And therefore, it gave me a self-belief in my ability to work, and that built confidence for me, right? So that was an excellent stage of my career. Then I did realize that it was probably paying a bit over the bills and I wanted more of a life in London. So I transitioned into tech sales. Chaotic. Quite frankly, suicidal as a career choice because there's so much chaos in that world. It's a startup, it's unregulated, and turns out because I was transitioning from industries, I was hired as the most junior entry point. And I found myself again in a very kind of scripted environment with rules and, you need to do 40 cold calls today and you need to do 30 emails. And I loved that as well because I had a line manager. Every day I would go in, I knew what I needed to do and I would go back knowing my progress. So there was like specific metrics around it. And as I said, throughout my 20s, my career became my hyper obsession. And I was just so focused on growing and progressing and getting promoted. And I succeeded in that. But something that I realized throughout the process is that each promotion I got and the more senior I became in my career, no one knows what they're doing. There's no rules around us. Everyone's winging it. And the more senior and senior you get, you just don't know what your day looks like or how to do things. Same situations are approached differently. And that led to me being completely and utterly stressed and debilitated in work. And I experienced burnout more times than I would like to admit. And yeah, that led me to ultimately leaving the corporate world as I turned 30 and to dedicate my time to things like this that I'm extremely passionate about. And I give that context because in that process, I did learn. It was incredibly lonely, of course, thinking like I've built all my 20s. Now I'm 30 when I'm meant to be established. And now I'm flipping the boat and I'm starting from scratch. Like this is where I'm meant to be enjoying and relaxing more. And that wasn't my case. And it was very lonely. But something that I learned in that process was that 80% of autistic adults aren't in full-time employment. Why is that figure so high? Why?
So there's so much in what you've just said. I could literally just sit here and listen to you rather than having to talk myself.
Sorry, I dropped a lot
fine.
there. But
it took me a little while to move on from the hotel thing because I did a job in a hotel and I was so rubbish at engaging with humans that they shut me away in the laundry room and I loved it. The amount of absolute joy you can get out of turning crumpled sheets into beautifully ironed sheets through the roller and then getting beautiful creases in exactly the right place. Absolute heaven. I spent hours and hours and hours doing that. Anyway, sorry, where were we? So one thing about that statistic is, and this is my kind of background in terms of supervising research students, statistics can be a little bit misleading. So those sorts of statistics are based on the numbers of individuals in those studies who are already recorded as being autistic.
Correct, yeah.
So we don't actually know what the real figures are. But we also do, by we, I mean general population and people in the know as well, do suspect that the number of individuals in full-time employment specifically is way, way, way lower than it probably should be compared to the non-autistic population. So why that might be the case is a brilliant question. So I refer to my term the predominant neurotype.
Yes.
Which I introduced in 2008 in my doctoral thesis to refer to the majority of the population in any given situation, and the way in which their brains operate. So if we accept the concept of neurodiversity and neurodivergence and accept that neurodivergent individuals, in this case autistic individuals, are in the minority, then in most situations the predominant neurotype will be non-neurodivergent.
Okay.
However, if you are a family of autistic people, then the predominant neurotype in that situation is autistic, which is gorgeous as well. But in the main, in society, the predominant neurotype are non-autistic individuals who might also have other neurodivergences, but in the main are not autistic. The world is set up for the majority. I think I'm probably accurate in saying, and that includes the world of work. So if things, pardon the pun, but if things work well at work, it's because they are set up for most people who are engaging. So by definition, statistically, if you're not part of that demographic norm, you're outside of that predominant neurotype, then there's a much higher risk of things not working for you. And I think it's literally as simple as that. And you can expand that right across the society as a whole. Society as a whole is set up for the predominant neurotype, which is why being autistic is to be so disadvantageous in a day-to-day world. And I don't think that people understand just how much of a disadvantage that is, because it's everything. It's literally every time you engage in a world that's set up not to suit you, you are at a slight to severe disadvantage. And then 5 minutes later, it's the same. And a minute later, it's the same. And 30 seconds later, it's the same. And it's the same. And it's the same. And it's the same. And that cumulative effect is huge, which is why so many autistic people then burn out, have meltdowns, shut down, autistic inertia, unable then to continue work and so on and so forth. The non-autistic population, I think, find it incredibly difficult to understand.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, if we take that fact for what it is, or if we take that stat, obviously with context on the stat, but if we take that to the population that isn't autistic, they'll probably debate, is it capability or is it workplace design? So we are agreeing that absolutely this is workplace design because it's not designed for autistic people.
And it's right from the outset. So how a post is advertised, for example, is it's advertised to reach the biggest audience, which is the predominant neurotype. And then the way in which you recruit individuals, often through interview, is because that's how it suits the predominant neurotype. Right from the outset, if you're the sort of individual who is unable to bear the level of pathological anxiety that having an interview will take out of you, then you don't apply for that job.
Absolutely.
Work capability, you might be the best person in the universe for that job, but that stumbling block is not a stumbling block. It's a literal barrier that makes you unable to even go through the application process. So straight away, you're at that disadvantage. And you can go all the way through. I'm sort of slightly giggling, and I'm allowed to because it's me, but I remember, this is a true story, being in a job. And I really, really, really wanted to apply for a different job. But the one thing that was really putting me off was because the organisation that I was in was well known for having really big, overt leaving parties for people. And I was so terrified of me being the centre of attention and having to have a leaving party, I was really disinclined to try and leave and get a different job. So you can see all the way from the outset in terms of applying for a job, all the way through to leaving a job, there are situations that might be problematic for the autistic individual.
Okay, and this is something you're writing in the book about, right? Because the book is about reasonable adjustments at the workplace. How does a workplace reduce that figure and reduce that barrier of entry to the workplace for autistic adults?
So for me, I found it really interesting when I started working on the book, because it was supposed to be one book about reasonable adjustments, and then I ended up splitting it into reasonable adjustment for children and then reasonable adjustments for adults, because I thought actually it's too big. But when I came to doing the reasonable adjustments for adults, it actually ended up all being based on a concept that I came up with, a new concept to me anyway, around what I termed autistic courtesy. Because I sort of didn't fall out of love with the concept of reasonable adjustments, because I love the idea of reasonable adjustments. But the idea that as an autistic person, you need a legal requirement just to suit your needs seems to me to be actually potentially a disadvantage in its own right, because you've got to declare that you're autistic, and then you've got to have an assessment, and then you've got to have other people, etc., etc., etc. Whereas autistic courtesy is the flip side, where people are thinking before you even have the chance to come forward and say, I might need adjustments, say, right, everybody will have differing needs at work. It doesn't matter whether you're neurodivergent, whether you're disabled, what age
You're a mother, whatever that might be.
Irrespective of that, exactly. So everybody will have differing requirements. And this idea of courtesy being, we're going to try and work out what those requirements are without you having to disclose, or without you having to sort of put yourself on a pedestal and say, I am autistic and therefore I need X, Y, and Z, without having to go down that kind of legal route. And actually, when I started doing this, in practice with my own course and trying to put autistic courtesy into place, what astounded me, maybe I shouldn't have been astounded, and it kind of, it made me, I wasn't shocked, but it's deeply depressing, is that so many of my mature students said this is the first time anybody has ever taken my autism into account on my behalf before me raising it as an issue. And I was thinking, there are these people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they've never had autistic courtesy before. And it was a real game changer in terms of trust, in terms of reduction of anxiety, all of those sorts of things. So I think reasonable adjustments all comes down to that word, anxiety.
Yeah.
What is going to reduce your anxiety, which will then lead you to be a more productive human being at work and happier? And everybody wins. And I think I love that idea in terms of autism plus environment equals outcome. If they then go, okay, well, environmentally, what is likely to cause you more anxiety? Is it an interview? Is it the fact that you need to check in every day at 12 o'clock to make sure you're on track? Is it, so something, for example, I do for some students who have high levels of anxiety about me reading their work. So somebody might submit a chapter of a thesis, and I know for a fact that their life is then on hold because they're so anxious until they get their feedback. And for some students, they might expect that to take 2 weeks. So I'm then exposing them to 2 weeks worth of anxiety, as opposed to, if I know who they are, saying, okay, well, let's agree that on Monday, the 16th of blah, 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 at midday, you will submit. I've got that in my diary. 2 hours later, you'll get your feedback.
That's wonderful.
So something as simple as that, it takes me exactly the same amount of time, whether I put it in my diary or not. But the difference is, I've taken that individual's anxiety into account in this example, and they can have 2 hours worth of anxiety rather than 2 weeks. And I think you can do that in the workplace on an individual basis incredibly effectively.
Absolutely. Completely off topic, but that anxiety that you just brought up brought me back to a memory when I was a kid and we went on summer breaks. I was held up for 2 months or however the summer break was in utter anxiety of thinking, when I go back to school, are my friends still going to be my friends? And that first day of school, for me, I just remember I would make myself sick. I was so nervous. And then to realize that they were greeting me the same way that they did before the summer, I would get into this rage of excitement because I was like, they're still my friends. And I completely agree with you. If I analyze my life from childhood, school to university to even work, it's understanding where that anxiety comes from to then be able to cater is wonderful, because when I got diagnosed, I communicated that to the workplace. It was the number one priority that I had. I thought it was the fair thing to do, the honest thing to do, as us autistic people love to ground ourselves in fairness. And, you know, whilst from a very kind place, they said, whatever you need, we're here to help you. And that was horrific for me, not because it was mean or anything. I knew it was meant with kindness, but because I had gotten diagnosed 6 days ago. I don't even know what autism is, much less what accommodations do I need. And just to have the tip that you said of ground yourself and what is anxiety triggering would have been extremely helpful for me back then, because then I could quickly say, it's extremely triggering for me when I'm having customer calls on an open floor. Can I please have an office? It's extremely triggering when 5 o'clock hits and I decide to stay 2 more hours in the office to avoid public transport. Can I leave sooner? All these things would have helped me figure out what my reasonable adjustments are. And whilst I don't think it's our responsibility to figure out what our reasonable adjustments are, it's a collective effort within the workplace. I think that is just so incredibly useful. So I think many people can take that away as well.
And while it's very individually based, there are broader things that can be implemented, again, for everybody. I think lots of autistic people hate being in the limelight. They hate being in the spotlight. They hate being
Here
the ones...
we are on a podcast, but it's for the right reasons, right? We both fundamentally agree that we hate the spotlight, but we want to spread the message.
And that's why, I'm so impressed with you. But having to be in the spotlight at work as well, with people that are potentially your line managers or colleagues or whatever, that's enough for some individuals to not go forward with their right of reasonable adjustments.
Yep.
So again, if it's for everybody, so we've got a broad policy and say, okay, well, communication is something within this particular institution that everybody needs to engage with. But we know there are multiple different types of communication. There's different ways of communicating in terms of different times during the day, in email or text message or Teams or whatever. And everybody can have a communication preference if they choose to do so. So it's your choice. You can either choose not to be bothered and go just do whatever, or we've got a shared Google document from the CEO all the way right across the company that says, if you've got a communication preference, stick it on here. And everybody needs to abide by that.
Yep.
So for me, for example, I can only speak for myself, and it does sort of make me giggle. And I've said this publicly before, so and I'm sure my colleagues know this by now. But in terms of communication, one of the things that cripples me with anxiety is when somebody pops their head round the door and says, oh, Luke, we do need a bit of a catch up. I'll arrange a meeting next week. That's it.
Am I getting fired right now? Am I on the naughty step?
I'm fired.
Tell
I've done
me.
something horrific. You know that I've got a diagnosis of terminal cancer that nobody else has told me. Something, and people say, "Oh, you're just catastrophizing."
No.
If that's how I feel, that's how I feel. So now people will start off, or even things actually even more innocent, if you like, in inverted commas. I've had lovely colleagues send me messages saying, "Oh, are you okay?" And straight away I think, well, I was, but I'm not anymore, because you
what
must
have I
know
done
something
to make you think that I'm not
exactly.
okay?
Somebody's told you that I'm in trouble or whatever. So now people will say, are you okay? I'm just checking because I care for your well-being.
That's
or
sweet.
We've got a meeting coming up. There's nothing bad about it. If you need to know an itinerary, then I'll let you know. Just something as simple as that straight away completely changes the whole dynamics of being at work. And not only that, in terms of an individual example, it allows you then to have trust in your work colleagues to then say, well, actually, there's something else that stresses me out. If we say a meeting is 12 until 12:30, can we please start at 12 and finish at 12:30? Because
can we not wait for the latecomers? They can get their coffee before. If they decide to be late, let them be late. Can we crack on, please?
And if there is an agenda, what's the point of it unless you're going to stick to it? But anyway, that's just
150%. And to that point, not on the topic of work, but my sister has this sweet desire to make me feel comfortable about what she's going to tell me before she tells me. I love her deeply, but I always have to tell her, land the plane. Just tell me what's going on, and then I can feel good about it. But by you stringing out and not landing the plane, I'm really struggling here. It might be 10 seconds, but I am suffering. So please land the plane.
I know somebody whose her communication preferences is through voice notes, which is fine. But they are extraordinarily verbose. And these voice notes go on, they seem to me to go on forever, which again is fine. That's their preference. But in the end, I did have to contact them and say, can you start off your voice note with saying, this is not a problem, and then go on to tell me whatever it is.
I'll listen
Otherwise,
to you.
I'm literally waiting till the end thinking something awful is going to be said right at the end, 10 minutes later.
Yeah, for me, one of the issues I have in communication is a random phone call. Please don't do that, because I think drastic, but I think someone might have passed away. Like, drop me a text, something. My form of communication that I prefer is texting. I would text all day long and I'll in a second respond, but it's the phone call. My phone calls last on average 10 seconds. It's like, hi, how are you? Do you need anything? No, bye. And that's it. I just really struggle with unexpected questions that I can process to then give you the correct answer. And especially if we're not on daily communication basis. If you pick up the phone with no prior text, first of all, I won't be picking up, because that's me listening to my needs. And then I'll drop you a text saying, hey, is everything okay? What do you need? But I guess it's all about understanding what our communication preferences are and then communicating that. To that point, so autistic courtesy and reasonable adjustments, are they enforced by law?
So it's still a bit of a grey area because there hasn't been enough case study. So autism is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, in terms of that, the sense of being autistic allows you, in inverted commas, and you don't actually need well, technically, you don't need a formal identification of autism to be covered by law as well. So it does get very complex on an individual basis. But essentially, my way of understanding is the law sees autism as a disability. That's probably for a different podcast, or the same podcast but a different date, or with somebody who's more expert in that area. But as an autistic person, if you are at a substantial disadvantage, so that's a terminology,
Mm-hmm.
as a result of being autistic, and it would be deemed reasonable for your employer to make an adjustment, then it would be unlawful for them not to. And
Okay.
I think that's the easiest way of thinking about it. So, are you at a substantial disadvantage by somebody phoning you off a withheld number that then sends you into a spiral? It means you've got to take the next day off. As an example, I would argue that puts you at a substantial disadvantage. Would it be reasonable to say, okay, we're never going to phone you off a withheld number. We're going to put in place a situation whereby I'm going to send you a text, say, in 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a call. This is a number I'm going to call you off, and this is the content of the nature of the call. Would that be reasonable for me to do? If the answer is yes, it would be unlawful for me not to.
Okay. Brilliant. A question I have on the back of that is, you said it's reasonable for the workplace. Who decides if it's reasonable or not? How do we measure something being reasonable as an adjustment?
Again, that's where it becomes a really grey area. So some of it does come down to the amount of resource in terms of time, effort, money, all of those sorts of things within the institution. Which I've got sort of mixed feelings about, because sometimes you think, okay, well, if I was to put all of this in place for one human being, it might be legally unreasonable because it's cost so much from the outset. My argument is it's not for one person, it's for every individual who finds themselves in that situation from this point onwards.
Absolutely.
Forever.
Yep.
And actually sometimes that initial cost, for whatever reason, and it might be economic cost, but it might be a personnel cost or whatever, that gets diluted every single day that's been implemented thereafter. So it is very much a grey area, but I don't think it's a particularly good excuse when people say, oh, but it's only for one person, because I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, and to that point, it's also the motion of who discloses their autism at work, right? Because you might be amongst colleagues that or don't know they're autistic or are diagnosed autistic but don't want to disclose it, and that is completely fair, you know. I had to make that decision myself when I was in a high-pressured environment with people that were overlooking me and my ability to perform in this job, and was I going to out my invisible disability in a world that didn't understand my disability? What a stupid thing to do, I thought. But then the desire to share my story and have other women relate to what I was going through, because I knew there were so many out there, made me make that decision. But it wasn't easy at all. And I do know for a fact that there's a lot of autistic people that do not want to share their diagnosis, right? So in order to get these reasonable adjustments, do I need to disclose that I'm autistic in the workplace?
So I think there are real pros and cons to disclosure, and it's one of those sorts of areas that sometimes feels a bit uncomfortable to talk about, because people say, oh, you know, somebody might say, I'm proudly autistic and I want people to know. But the inference then is, if you don't want to disclose, then that somehow means you're not proud. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think some individuals have I know for a fact that some individuals have extraordinarily good, valid, authentic reasons for not disclosing to the public or to colleagues or at work. And I have known, unfortunately, this is a horrible thing to say, but it's true. I know of actual individuals in my life who have disclosed at work, for whom then the repercussions have been extraordinarily negative. So, for example, an extreme example might be, but it sounds extreme, but it's true, and it was only over the last few months, a GP of 18 years as a partner in her business happened to disclose that they were autistic and then got put on a fitness to work program as a direct result of disclosure, which is extraordinary. I can see you frowning, but it's true. And that might sound like an extreme example. Unfortunately, I hear these
It's,
sorts
I
of
don't think
stories
that it's,
often.
I frown because it deeply upsets me, but also the upsetting part is that she is one case of many. I am so sure that happens in so many fields, and we speak about the progress autism has had over the past years, but those are the moments. It's my podcast. I can curse. They piss me off, those moments, because it is so unfair for this woman who has obviously been fit for 18 years to practice. Now, all of a sudden, just because she has decided to communicate she's autistic, it's questioned. Come
Exactly.
on.
And I'm hoping that for every individual that discloses those sorts of workplace situations to me, there's myriad others for whom it's positive. That's what I'm hoping.
Yes.
And I suppose we don't actually know. But going back to your initial question, I think it should be needs-led rather than label-led. So if an individual has got a need, if say, for example, I went into work and said, excuse me, blah, 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 it makes me incredibly anxious, the way that this is going, is it possible to reduce my anxiety by doing X, Y, and Z? And to have that conversation without somebody having to go in and here's my piece of paper that states that I've got this particular disability. Da, 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 da. I think it's fantastic when individuals can share the news of their being autistic to raise understanding within their community. And I think that's both brave and admirable and incredibly positive for some individuals and institutions. And I think that's brilliant when I hear those stories. But I also think you should have your needs met irrespective of whether you choose to do that or not.
Completely agree with you. Something I want to pick back up is something that you mentioned about when do these adjustments start? And they obviously start for you, as you mentioned, in that first ad. I probably have a tad of PTSD from interviews. And I think fundamentally that is where a big part of it goes really wrong, because interviews for the workplace, at the core, they're performative. They're vague in their nature, and they're all based around these situational moments and put yourself in the situation. No, I'm sorry, I can't. Can you give me accuracy? I don't want to read between the lines. Also, you are being judged based on how you react in the moment. An autistic person's nightmare, okay? However, because they are a pressure cooker environment, what have we done most of our life? Mask, perform. Don't tell me twice. I'm going to give you the interview of your life. You've never seen anyone dance this way in an interview. And of course, I'm going to get the job. I will always land the job. Now, the issue we have is what happens afterwards, because I've put on such a show that now I'm expected to maintain that performance throughout employment. No, thank you. And I think that is where a big piece of like the constant expectation to show up based on how they perceive you, just because we've masked through interviews to be part of the neurotype that it's built for. So is there a way in which we can make interviews more accessible and less demonic?
So I am continually perplexed about interviews. So for your listeners and for you, how many people who are listening to this know somebody that they've worked with who is rubbish at their job?
I plead the fifth.
And of those individuals, how many of those got the job by being interviewed? And the answer is usually that is the way. So we can prove quite definitively that the interview process produces people, not everybody, but some people who are rubbish at the job. Therefore, categorically, interviews are not a 100% effective way of recruiting individuals. Of those individuals who are rubbish at their job that you know, who finally left or you got rid of them, what did the employer then do in terms of recruitment? They went back out to interview. So it's a bizarre situation where absolutely categorically we finally got rid of the person that we employed through an interview process, and we're going to repeat that interview process to find the next person, which seems to me to be utterly illogical. So I think the whole interview process itself is fundamentally flawed, and I genuinely think most people know that. Being interviewed shows the panel how good you are at being interviewed.
Yes.
And if being interviewed is not part of your day-to-day job, how effective is that in terms of demonstrating to the panel how good or otherwise you might be at doing the job? Almost all autistic people who have expressed an opinion to me anyway, and that I've read about, will say just let me do the job and judge whether I'm any good at it or not. If it's just for 5 minutes, if that's all I'm allowed, or 5 days, or whatever. If I'm no good, get rid of me. If I'm good, employ me. It's as simple as that. And I think actually that's a very effective way of doing it. But going back to your original question, which is how can you make interviews more friendly, reduction of anxiety. We know that the more anxious you are, the less cognitive ability you'll have. So if you're in an interview situation, your anxiety is through the roof, and everybody feels anxious, or most people feel anxious about being interviewed, but the level of anxiety for autistic people is often way, 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 way higher, which means they're more at a disadvantage. So we've got a program at Sheffield Hallam University fairly recently where we've gone through a process of giving people the questions before the interview.
That's wonderful.
And that's for everybody. You don't have to disclose. Everybody gets a chance to see the questions before the interview, which I think is a good idea. I don't see why you wouldn't do that. And also, I think giving the option for reasonable adjustments for every single individual who is part and parcel of that goes back to that concept of, well, in this case, autistic courtesy, but human courtesy. It's like, okay, what can we do through this interview process to reduce your anxiety? Here's a QR code. If you scan the QR code, there's a video walkthrough of what the environment is going to look like. That costs 30 seconds of your time. Every single person who is applying for that job that's got through to the interview process now knows what the environment looks like. Do you want the lighting? Do you want the curtains open or closed? Have you got an issue with direct lighting? Do you have an issue with people sitting behind a table staring at you, or would you prefer it to be in a semicircle? All of those things are free of charge that take a minimal amount of effort that could make all the difference to that individual for whom it does make a difference. So there's myriad things that you can do through the whole interview process. Even such things as, I don't know what it is I'm supposed to wear. Can you give me a guidance on what you expect? Because does it matter or doesn't it?
We're chameleons. I can rock up in sweats. I can rock up in a heeled boot and a suit. You got to give me guidance.
Exactly. Even things like, do you have a preference in terms of keeping to time? Some people, bizarrely, this might shock some of your listeners, some people don't seem to care less if things don't stick to time. If, on the other hand, all you're focused on is my interview time was 10:30, it's now 10:31, I'm literally about to dive off this chair and run out because I cannot cope with the fact that you told me it was a 10:30 interview. If you are of the ilk, let me know, we'll make sure you're the first person in. And therefore, we 100%. Know for a fact that your time will not be overrun. There's so many different things that you can do as you taking the context of courtesy into account that you can then apply to everybody without anybody having to disclose.
And I think everything you described is the ideal scenario for the future, unfortunately, because whoever's doing that, which is your university, is one of a kind. In my short career, I've never heard of that. And I do fear that for our listeners, whilst that is the gold standard, not everyone is practicing that. So how would someone that's listening to us today navigate that interview process? How can they advocate for that interview process to be a tad more friendly to their autistic brain?
Because I think it's a win-win situation for everybody.
Yeah.
If you have got an autistic person who is really good at that job, we want that person to be employed.
Absolutely.
In which case, we want them to do as best as they possibly can through that interview process. And I think the more individuals who are able to articulate and say things before, and again, I don't like the onus of responsibility being on the individual. I think it should be on the institution. However, the institutions can encourage people as an example and say, for example, in the past, we've had individuals say, okay, I find it incredibly stressful being face-to-face with people because I really struggle with eye contact. Is it okay if we sit adjacent to one another? And we can interview perfectly well sitting adjacent to one another, and your job doesn't involve being face-to-face over a desk, so therefore it's not an indication as to whether you're any good at your job. So in the past, and then give exemplars of the sorts of things that institution has made in the past, so that when somebody else comes, oh, I'd never even thought of that myself. It goes back to what you were saying. How do you know what you don't know? It's like, oh, I'd never thought that sitting next to somebody rather than in front of them might reduce my anxiety. So yeah, I'm going to opt for that option and be comfortable with the fact that I'm not going to be discriminated against as a direct result.
100%. And actually something that happened to me once in an interview, I decided to not go for the job, by the way, for this reason, but some random person joined mid-interview. I hadn't been given notice of who this person was. Turns out it was the sister of the founder who's also vetting. I need to know who is vetting me for me to cater my communication. Of course, I want to be picked. So tell me who's joining. Isn't that, I don't even think that's autistic courtesy. That is interview courtesy overall. And I think autistic or not, when you're going through these processes, how organizations and corporations act in the interview is telling as to how that employment might go for you, right? It's the same way in relationships. We say, listen to the red flags, because they won't go away, right? They're just exacerbated once you're in the relationship or that employment. So it's listening to the red flags of things you like or don't.
I think the other thing, it's veering a little bit away from the interview process itself, but more to do with, I don't even like the words, but job descriptions and person specifications and what the expectation is on a future employee. And I think there are far too many institutions where those sorts of job descriptions, shall we say, are overly generic, and they don't need to be.
Yeah.
And actually, that's quite diametrically opposite to what we know about the autistic spiky profile, for example. So we know that most autistic people, if not all autistic people, will have spiky profiles. So they'll be really, really good in certain areas and really struggle in others, which is fine. Most autistic people just go through life trying to get rid of the things that they're not so good at and then focus on the things that they're good at, which makes perfect logical sense. If, on the other hand, you've got a generic job description, which means you've got to be vaguely good at everything, then you're going to be at a disadvantage, which then puts the employee at a disadvantage, missing out on your skill level.
Yes.
So things like very generic communication skills. This is one that really, really drives me mad. When people say, okay, in a job interview, we require good communication skills. So do you have, and I want to say, well, I can write a book in a week. If you leave me on my own to do that, I can speak comfortably at a conference. Whether I'm any good or not is up for you to decide, but I can do that to thousands of people. I can speak one-on-one to a lovely person hosting a podcast without any stress. Stick me in a team meeting when I don't know the agenda and blah, blah. I would prefer to, well, anyway, does that make me a good communicator or not? Do you know what I mean? It's like, just be specific. What do you actually mean? And then I can match up whether I've got the skill levels for it or not.
And do you know what I feel like? Maybe it's giving me food for thought why autistic people are discriminated in certain situations like this. Because we're the only ones challenging the status quo like that, right? We are specific. Give us the specifics of it, right? Because by you being vague, everyone follows through with that. It's only the autistic people that say, what do you mean by that? Please make it clearer.
100%. So in my head, I was thinking of something that I didn't get the chance to get out, but you've just given me the perfect platform. If I was in charge, goodness knows, I will never be in charge of anything, hopefully, for the world.
I always said, Luke, sorry to cut you off. I've always said, nobody wants me to be their manager. I wouldn't want me to be their manager. That's why I never went into management, because I was like, worst nightmare. No.
I was a line manager once, and about 95% of my team hated me, and the other 5% absolutely loved me. So it was a bit of a marmite, but very much on the non-line. Anyway, if I was in charge of interviews, I would love to be able to say to prospective employees, if we as a panel ask you a question and you find it ambiguous, pick us up on it.
Yeah.
And ask us, say, well, actually, that has got an ambiguous meaning. And we're not going to come back and go, oh, well, that's too pedantic. The idea of being too pedantic is oxymoronic to me. It's just linguistic accuracy. You're at fault for making it ambiguous in the first place. So to encourage that open discussion, I think is gorgeous. Absolutely lovely. The other thing, just to follow on from what you said about line management, and I did write this in the book, and obviously there are lots of scenarios where this isn't possible. However, to be absolutely honest, human beings do matter. This idea that all managers are equal because they've got the same position, I don't think is fair. I would love it if, when possible, autistic employees had the option or a choice of who their line manager might be, because connectivity with your line manager and understanding from your line manager as an autistic person can literally be the make or break for your career.
And I've seen people decide to not go for a promotion because they didn't like the person that was going to manage them. And that is fundamentally sad, but also it's a red flag in that organization, right? And I would go along with that. I would love to choose my line manager because I think it's a make or break for the career. Because I've had an excellent sales manager. She shaped me. Some people disliked her because she was too direct, too abrupt. I thrived in that. I was like, whack me some more. Tell me how it's done well so I can do well. And we got along like a house on fire, but not everyone likes that, right? So, bit off topic, but I would love to get your thoughts on, are there any careers that are naturally neurodivergent friendly? Because, disclosure, I have a dog who I treat like my own son. And I have heard through social media when posting that, for example, vets is a very naturally autistic friendly career. What are your thoughts on that? Are there any careers out there?
So I've got a lovely story about vets. I was involved with a university vicariously. To cut a long story short, they were having lots of autistic people apply for their veterinary program, and then a lot of those autistic individuals were dropping out. And it turned out the reason they were dropping out was because of the group work component of the course. And I made the comment, surely these individuals are going into becoming vets because they like animals, not humans. And presumably they don't particularly want to engage with humans. So why is it a mandatory component on the course to have group work? So they changed their practice, and group work was still part of the curriculum, but it was optional. So students could opt out of it and do the same work individually.
Yeah.
And they contacted me 2 or 3 years later saying, we're now churning out loads of autistic vets. And that's a true story. And I think that's gorgeous. So going back to reasonable adjustments, in this case at a university, just making that slight change and saying, look, it's not imperative that you work as part of a group. You can do the work autonomously on your own. And all of a sudden, that's the difference between a student dropping out of university and an individual becoming a fully qualified vet, which is gorgeous.
Absolutely. And we all know the affinity autistic people have with animals.
100%. And also traumatized animals. So this is not researched as much as it perhaps should be. So if anybody wants to do a PhD, but I think there's something about the mutual support an autistic person who's gone through trauma and an animal that's also gone through trauma can give to each other, that sort of symbiotic relationship. I've seen it in real life and it is exquisite. And I don't know if it's a real thing. It is a real thing, definitely, on an individual basis. I don't know, broader speaking, whether it's but I think it's something that should definitely be researched. We're really going off topic now, but
we are. But I'm here for it, and it's funny. I find this. I'm too Irish to be cheesy many times, but brace for impact because this is very cheesy. What I'm going to say. My little dog. He's a little greyhound. Nothing's ever happened to him. He got attacked when he was 4 months, but they didn't get him, right. So the trauma that he has isn't justified by that action. But he's incredibly nervous. He's never been able to socialize with dogs. He's been to puppy training. We've had a trainer weekly for over a year with no progress, not down to the trainer's fault. It's just he is fundamentally extremely nervous as a dog. However, when he gets back home, he is a little terror. The personality comes out. He's just so sweet and funny, as if you can say that about a dog, but I see it in him. And funny enough, I told my mom the other day, I see me as a kid in him, as to going out to school, being horrified of the world, so scared to be out there, make friends. But as soon as I got home after school, that 5 o'clock to 9 p.m. going to bed was my favorite part of the day. Because I was in my comfort zone, I was with the people I loved, and I could just be myself. And as cheesy as that is my affinity to my dog's personality. So, yeah, I love it.
I love that story. I can just imagine it as well. I could go on and on about animals, but anyway, going back to your question about, I'm going to swerve the question. The reason being is I'm too fed up with autism myths. This kind of concept of, autistic people must be good at IT, or autistic people, that means you're good at art, or if you're autistic, can you apply for a job at a theatre? Well, you must be the light engineer. You can't possibly be an actor. Hello, I find that one really bizarre. It's like, what? Have you ever met masking? But anyway, I think there's what I do like is flipping it around. So this idea that people say, autistic people cannot ... So autistic people cannot be good actors. Autistic people cannot be a good teacher. Autistic people can't be a GP, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I love challenging some like my students, for example. I sometimes start off with saying, okay, autistic people cannot ... go away, ruminate on it, come back with an end to that sentence that's applicable to all autistic people, and see how far you get.
I'll
And
give you one. We cannot stand injustice, and we will always speak up for it.
I think that is
because I think that's
incredibly common.
Because that is a shared experience with many autistic people. The strong moral ground that we have, and whilst we might not always decide to address it publicly to people, we carry that injustice deeply in our heart. So I think that is something that makes me proud to be autistic.
I think that's lovely. The one I tend to give as a Kickstarter, I would say autistic people cannot not be autistic, which is applicable to all autistic people.
That's more accurate than the one I gave.
But it's a challenging, and there are others. I won't give any spoilers. You can think of them yourselves,
Yeah.
but it's very few and far between to get an end to that sentence that's applicable to all autistic people, which then makes an absolute mockery when people then go, oh, but autistic people can't, blah, 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 and come out with whatever. As soon as somebody says autistic people can't, I switch off.
Okay, we're wrapping up. But when I started this conversation, I asked you that you've been in the industry for 30 years in the field of autism. And how has that transition been over the years? And you've spoken about the exponential growth and an awareness over the past 5 to 10 years. With that in mind and, thinking of the progress we've made, what does the future look like for people with autism?
I was asked at a conference what I would like in the future. And I said, I'd like to not exist. Not in that kind of like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. I didn't want to wink out of existence. I meant that my job and jobs like it are no longer ever needed because people had that understanding already and conferences were a thing of a past and so on. These podcasts wouldn't exist. I don't want you not to exist, but I would love it.
No, I want this to do the job it needs to do and we move on with life.
Exactly.
For life to be easier for people like me.
But in the interim, I want you and the Spicy Brain podcast and all of those other amazing podcasts that are autistic-led to flood the airwaves. And by the way, I love words. I'm a linguistic animal, and the Spicy Brain is such a genius
Do you think
name.
so?
That
makes me so happy.
The concept of neurospiciness, I think, is utterly delicious. He said, shoehorning a ridiculous kind of pun in there. But no, I think it's great. And so the future has got to be handed over to autistic individuals of all intersectionalities to lead the way. Alongside autistic allies, that juxtaposition of autistic individuals and autistic allies who are non-autistic, I think is absolutely gorgeous.
That's brilliant. No, I love that. Okay, now to really finish. As someone who's autistic, I love things in threes. I usually speak in threes. As you can see, the logo of the podcast is 3 chilies. So it just felt right to finish every episode that we have with a guest with 3 spicy fire questions. Are you ready?
I love things in threes. Those observant people who are bothered to read my books will notice that every single book I've written that I've authored solo, all of the chapters are in multiples of 3.
Well, we're a match made in heaven because here goes my 3 questions, okay? Number 1, autism being a superpower or not?
I failed at the first hurdle because it was supposed to be a quick fire. So I think lots of people get very, very frustrated when people refer to autism as a superpower because it isn't for lots of individuals, and it gives the wrong impression of the lived experience of autistic people. However, being autistic for some individuals can lead to extraordinary levels of passion around certain areas that to those individuals themselves, they might regard as their own individual superpower. So on an individual level, absolutely happy for individuals to claim that. As a generic population, less so.
Okay, question number 2. One workplace rule you'll delete immediately today if you had the chance.
Open plan offices.
That is the tech dream, to have open plan offices. I did really struggle, to be honest, so I'm right there with you. Number 3, how are you? Is that a genuine question or a social trap?
You're probably asking the wrong person. It stresses me out. Do you know, honestly, if people say, how are you to me, I immediately just think, I don't know now. Like, why are you asking? Because do you really want to know? Because if you genuinely give the answer, people tend to walk away. But it seems like it's a linguistic game, I think, that people play as part of their ongoing engagement. So I think it's supposed to put people at ease and maybe lead on to other things. It's like an opening gambit.
Yeah.
I don't think it's meant as genuine as, well, maybe it depends on who's asking whom.
Tell me how you really are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But a little word of warning, often, in my experience, people don't actually really want to know, because when you do start divulging, they say, well, no, I didn't really want to hear about
that's
that.
my issue. Someone asks me, how are you? I'm going to tell you how my day has been, good or bad, but you're going to know the whole lowdown. And then I realize I've been talking for 5 minutes and they're not even listening. Maybe I went too far. So, okay. Can I ask you a bonus question?
Go on then.
Did you enjoy this conversation?
I absolutely have adored every second.
Oh, thank you so much.
Genuinely. It's such a privilege to be part of engaging with you and your podcast. And I love listening to autistic people and learning that much more.
Brilliant. Well, the pleasure is mutual. It has been, I feel extremely lucky to have you on the podcast as a guest. And I was saying earlier to the team, like, someone of your caliber to come onto the podcast, I would have expected maybe if Spicy Brain took off like I dream of it to take off and reach as many autistic people and allies out there as possible, maybe you would have come on, Luke, say season 5, when you've seen what we've done, who we've been speaking with. Here you are, season 1, first ever guest. All I want to say is I think people spend majority of their life wanting to do meaningful work. You have been doing that for 30 years. So for the work you've done and the work you continue to do, I just want to say thank you, because you've genuinely impacted the life of so many autistic people, including myself. So thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.